Jake had just gotten home from work when he noticed a man sitting calmly on the front porch of his house. He was wearing a gray cardigan, dark slacks, and a pair of shiny leather shoes. He had a small brown suitcase sitting beside him and a warm smile stretched across his face as Jake approached. He stood up slowly and said, "Hello Jake, it is so good to see you again. It has been too long." Confused Jake tilted his head and replied, "I am sorry, do I know you?" The man chuckled and said, "Of course you do. I am your grandfather, your father's father from up north. I finally came to visit." Jake felt a chill in his chest, because he had never once heard about his father's father. His parents never spoke of any relatives from that side, and he had grown up thinking his family tree ended at his dad and mom, but this man seemed confident, calm, even affectionate as he spoke about little details in Jake's life. He mentioned the elementary school Jake had gone to, the time he broke his arm falling from the neighbor's tree, even Jake's job at the local automotive shop. It was eerie how much he knew, and Jake felt torn between suspicion and guilt. The man seemed harmless and polite, and something about his soft voice made it difficult to confront him outright. The man said he was only staying for a couple days, and he had nowhere else to go, so Jake reluctantly invited him inside, thinking he would call his parents later and ask if this was some surprise reunion. As they stepped into the house, Jake's dog Miko, a retired police K9, instantly perked up from his usual nap and growled low from across the living room. It was not like Miko to act aggressive unless something was truly wrong. He had always been well-trained, social and protective, but not hostile. Yet here he was standing stiff, ears high, teeth exposed. As the stranger walked in, the man paused and said, "Oh, what a lovely dog. You must be Miko, right?" And he extended a hand casually, but Miko barked loudly and lunged forward, making Jake grab his collar and pull him back. Startled, the man stepped back and laughed nervously, saying, "Maybe he just needs time to get used to me." Jake apologized and put Miko outside for the moment, watching the dog pace back and forth along the glass door. Still growling, the man sat down in the living room as if he had always belonged there and began telling Jake about how he had been living in remote places, how he had recently retired and wanted to reconnect with family before it was too late. Something felt off. Jake could not explain it, but his instincts told him to be careful. Still, he did not want to come off as rude or paranoid, so he offered the man dinner and called his parents while the man was in the bathroom. His mom answered and was just as confused, saying she had no idea who the man could be, and that Jake's real grandfather had passed away years ago in a different country and was never spoken of because of a complicated history. She swore up and down that this had to be a mistake or maybe even a scammer. Jake hung up and stared at the hallway, where the man was now humming to himself behind the bathroom door. It was too late to ask him to leave tonight, and it did not feel safe to push him just yet, so Jake made up the guest room and decided to keep his phone nearby. He let Miko back inside, and the dog instantly ran to the guest room door, sniffing and whining. Jake laid in bed that night with his eyes wide open and a heavy feeling in his chest. Something was very wrong, and the next morning he was going to find out exactly what. The next morning, Jake woke up early after a restless night and found the smell of coffee and toast drifting through the hallway. When he got to the kitchen, the man was already there, wearing a clean pressed shirt and humming a quiet tune as he made breakfast for the whole family. He greeted Jake with a cheerful good morning and handed him a plate, as if this had always been his routine. Jake felt a knot in his stomach tighten even more when he saw Miko sitting in the corner watching the man closely, ears flat, tail stiff. No barking this time, but the intensity in his stare made Jake uneasy. The man began telling more stories over breakfast about the places he had lived and how he used to work in logistics for international companies, how he spent years moving from city to city and had finally decided to come back to his roots. But every time Jake asked for a specific name or date, the man would smile and say it was all such a blur now after so many years. Jake's parents arrived a little later, still confused about the whole thing, and when they saw the man, they looked even more puzzled. The man stood up and gave Jake's mother a warm hug as if they had shared memories. She pulled away gently and whispered to Jake that she still had no idea who he was. The man brushed it off, saying memory loss comes in waves, and sometimes faces slip through the cracks. But Jake noticed again how polished his shoes were, how neat his suitcase looked, and how he always kept it close by as if it held something precious or important. He even brought it to the dinner table, placing it gently beside his chair. When Jake asked what was in it, the man chuckled and said just clothes and old letters, nothing worth mentioning. That response sat wrong with Jake, but he nodded and pretended to let it go. Later that day, Jake took Miko for a walk around the block, hoping to clear his head. Miko kept stopping and looking back toward the house every few steps, as if he was worried to leave it unguarded. When they returned, Jake found the man sitting on the back porch talking on a small flip phone in a language Jake didn't recognize, and the moment he saw them, he quickly ended the call and smiled, saying it was just an old friend from the nursing home where he used to volunteer. Jake didn't believe a word of it, but he had no proof and no plan. Yet that night, while the man claimed to be reading in the guest room, Miko paced back and forth in front of the door, growling quietly. and occasionally letting out a soft whine. Jake told him to relax, but Miko didn't listen. Instead, he lay flat on the floor with his nose under the door and refused to leave. When Jake finally knocked and asked the man if he needed anything, the man opened the door just wide enough to say he was fine and then closed it again firmly. Jake went back to his room and grabbed his old laptop. He typed in everything he could remember about the man, the name he gave, the places he mentioned, but nothing came up. No records, no social profiles, no news articles, not even a cemetery listing. If he really was someone important or connected, he had left no trace. Jake felt a growing sense of dread and decided that if nothing changed by the next day, he would call Marcus, his longtime friend, at the precinct and ask him to come over casually just to see if he noticed the same cracks that Jake did, because the man in his guest room was not who he said he was and Jake needed someone to confirm he was not imagining things. By the third morning, the stranger had made himself more comfortable than Jake expected. He now wore a pair of Jake's old slippers and moved around the house like it was his own, pouring coffee without asking and giving unsolicited advice about everything from lawn care to finances. He continued to keep that small brown suitcase within arm's reach no matter where he sat or moved. Jake found it strange how the man never once let it out of sight, not even when he used the restroom, and that fact alone kept nagging at him. Meanwhile, Miko's behavior had become more intense. Instead of pacing and growling, he now barked if the man so much as stepped into the hallway alone, and twice during the night he had stood rigid in front of the guest room door, tail stiff, head low, teeth showing, but not attacking, just guarding as if he knew something was behind that door that needed watching. Jake started leaving his phone on record during the night, placing it near the guest room, and each morning he reviewed the audio files hoping for something, but all he heard were footsteps pacing the floor and low murmurs. Sometimes the man would speak to himself or maybe to someone on that same flip phone, though the words were unclear and foreign. Jake felt trapped by his own politeness, unsure how to demand answers without escalating the situation. Then that afternoon, while sweeping the porch, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. He saw a smear of fresh mud on the edge of the welcome mat and traced the prints to the side of the house where they disappeared into the gravel walkway. There had been no rain recently, and Jake knew no one had left the house, not even himself. The stranger claimed he had stayed inside all day, saying he was resting his back. When Jake asked if he had stepped outside, the man smiled and said just for a moment to breathe some fresh air. Jake nodded but felt the tension in his spine rise even more. Later, he walked past the guest room and saw the man sitting on the edge of the bed flipping through what looked like an old leather notebook. When Jake asked what it was, the man quickly closed it and said just some memories from the past, nothing interesting. He looked annoyed for the first time, not nervous, but irritated, as if Jake was starting to push too close. That was enough. Jake decided to call Marcus, his friend who worked with the local precinct and had known Miko back during their active duty days. Marcus agreed to stop by that evening under the pretense of catching up and bringing over some tools Jake pretended to need for a garage project. When Marcus arrived, the man seemed pleasant as usual, shaking hands and offering a drink, but the moment their eyes met, Marcus stiffened just slightly. Only someone like Jake would have noticed it. Marcus sat down and chatted easily, but gave Jake a subtle look, one he had used many times during undercover operations back when they did volunteer patrols. It was a signal that said something was not right. As the three of them talked, the man began to get more guarded. His stories became more vague, and he laughed nervously more often. Marcus asked him questions about where he had served during his career, and the man gave names of towns that didn't exist or dates that didn't line up. Afterward, Marcus stepped outside to take a call and sent Jake a message saying he had snapped a quick photo of the man and sent it to a contact who could run a background check. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he stared through the window at the man who now stood in the hallway gazing at a family photo on the wall as if studying it, not remembering it, and Jake suddenly realized that he was not looking at a guest, but at someone who had inserted himself into their lives with a purpose, and that purpose was still hidden inside that suitcase. Marcus returned from the call with a calm expression and resumed the conversation as if nothing had happened. He asked the man if he had ever worked overseas or traveled much for his job, to which the man replied, "Oh yes, many times. I used to coordinate shipments across continents and spend a lot of time in Europe and Asia." Marcus nodded slowly, then asked what cities he liked best, and the man hesitated for just a second too long before naming cities that didn't match any trade routes or common business hubs. It was small but noticeable, and Marcus glanced at Jake, then at the suitcase that still sat by the man's feet untouched. The man caught that glance and chuckled nervously, saying, "This little thing has followed me everywhere. I cannot travel without it. Just some mementos, nothing serious." Marcus smiled, but in his eyes Jake could see the same realization growing. Both of them knew something was off, not just strange, but wrong. The man's comfort level, his carefully told stories, His attention to detail when it came to Jake's life, but complete vagueness about his own everything screamed performance. Later, when the man excused himself to the restroom, Marcus leaned in and told Jake quietly that the photo had been processed. And the search came up with nothing: no matching name, no legal ID, no military or pension records, no local or federal documentation. It was as if the man did not exist. Marcus said, if someone erases their identity to this level, they are either hiding from something or planning something. Jake felt his stomach twist. He asked Marcus what to do, and Marcus said, not yet, no confrontation, we need proof, we need something inside that suitcase. Marcus left shortly after to avoid suspicion, saying he would return in a couple days with some gear for the garage. While the man smiled and waved politely, Miko followed him to the door, then turned and growled again at the man who stood behind Jake in the hallway. Later that night, the man went to bed early, claiming fatigue and that he had a headache. Jake watched him carefully, then decided to test something. He placed a small folded piece of paper on top of the suitcase when the man was brushing his teeth, then went back to his room. An hour later, he checked and the paper was gone. No explanation, no mention of it from the man, who acted like it had never been there. Miko began whining at the guest room door again, and Jake finally let him in just to see what he would do. The dog sniffed around the bed, then stopped in front of the suitcase and sat down stiff as a statue, ears forward, tail still. Jake reached down and nudged the suitcase slightly. Miko growled again, low and deep. Jake backed off, deciding that if Miko was warning him this strongly, there had to be something inside worth knowing. The next morning, Jake suggested they all have dinner out at a local diner to give his parents a break from cooking. The man declined, saying he had a stomach issue and would rather rest. Jake pretended to understand, but inside he felt more certain than ever that this man was not going anywhere and was trying to buy more time. Jake texted Marcus again and told him to come over the next night and bring whatever he needed, because one way or another they had to get into that suitcase and find out who this man really was before something happened that none of them could take back. Marcus arrived the following evening just after sunset, wearing his old work jacket and carrying a metal toolbox filled with nothing but a few tools and a discreet handheld scanner. He greeted everyone casually and chatted with Jake's parents. Before heading toward the garage with Jake following close behind, they pretended to look over a loose shelf bracket while Marcus quietly filled Jake in on what he had brought along, including a micro camera in case they got the chance to peek inside the suitcase. Jake told him the man had refused to go out again and had barely left the guest room all day. Instead, he sat by the window staring out at the backyard and flipping through the same leather notebook he had been guarding since day one. The suitcase never left his side, and Jake was starting to worry they were running out of time. While they talked, Miko stood outside the guest room door again, growling with his nose pressed against the frame. Marcus handed Jake the scanner and said, if you can get near the suitcase even for a second, run this over it and we might at least know if anything inside is metal or has wiring. Jake agreed and tucked the small device into his hoodie pocket. Later that evening, Jake knocked on the guest room door and asked the man if he wanted any tea or a heating pad for his back. The man opened the door a crack and declined politely, but Jake noticed his eyes were tired and his posture slightly more tense than usual. He waited until the door closed and then moved quickly, pretending to drop a pair of socks nearby, and casually passed the scanner near the suitcase. The device blinked and buzzed softly, picking up multiple objects inside that were dense and irregular, not just clothes or books. Something was definitely hidden in there. Jake whispered this to Marcus, who said, we have to get a look inside tonight once he falls asleep, but they had no idea if he even really slept or just pretended to rest with one eye open around midnight. The house was quiet and all lights were off. Jake crept down the hallway and saw that the guest room door was slightly ajar, just enough for Miko to slip through without sound. The dog patted in slowly and Jake waited, then followed him in, barely breathing. The man was in bed, turned toward the wall, breathing slow and steady, his suitcase resting beside the nightstand still locked. Jake reached for it, but Miko suddenly growled low and tense. Jake froze, thinking the man had woken up, but he did not move. Instead, Miko pushed his nose under the bed and barked loudly, waking the man in an instant, who jumped out of bed and shouted, what is going on? What are you doing in here? Jake backed away, raising his hands and saying, I thought I heard something. The man stared at him, eyes wide and wild, then lunged toward the suitcase, grabbed it, and shouted, stay away from my things. He shoved past Jake and stormed out of the room, running toward the garage with the suitcase in hand. Jake yelled for Marcus, who was already halfway down the stairs. Hearing the commotion, they both ran after the man, who now fumbled with the side door, trying to get it open before Marcus tackled him from behind and pinned him to the floor. The suitcase slid across the concrete and popped open on impact, spilling its contents all over the ground. What Jake and Marcus saw made them stop cold. Stacks of fake IDs, passports, wads of cash, dozens of photos of houses, neighborhoods, and families, surveillance images of people, some taken from a distance, others up close, and in each folder the man had labeled details, names, routines, addresses. It was a catalog of targets, and Jake's house was the most recent entry on top. The garage was dead silent for a few long seconds as Jake and Marcus stared at the mess spilled across the concrete floor, while the man underneath Marcus struggled weakly trying to twist free. Miko stood over the suitcase barking furiously, his body blocking the door as if daring anyone else to move. Jake bent down and began picking up the items one by one, feeling the weight of each piece of evidence in his hands. The fake passports were in multiple names, some with photos of the same man and others with slight changes like altered hairlines or different facial hair. The cash was organized in neat rubber bands, all in $100 bills, some crisp and new, others old and faded. What disturbed Jake most were the photographs, dozens of them printed and labeled, showing front yards, back doors, street views, and even close-ups of people clearly unaware they were being watched. Jake found one folder with his own name on it. Inside were photos of his house from angles he didn't even recognize, including one of him and his parents eating dinner through the front window. The realization hit him that this man had been watching them long before he ever sat on their porch claiming to be family. Marcus quickly called it in, speaking in a low, firm voice to dispatch, explaining the situation and requesting immediate backup. Within minutes, 2 unmarked cars pulled up and officers entered through the side gate, guns drawn, but calm and professional. They restrained the man, who now sat silently with his eyes lowered and lips tightly pressed together as if the act had finally crumbled and he no longer needed to pretend. One officer pulled Marcus aside and whispered something that made his expression harden when Jake asked what he said. Marcus replied, "This man has been on a watch list for months under multiple aliases, suspected of long-term cons and targeting vulnerable families. He had been slipping through the cracks by changing identities, using carefully crafted fake documents, and avoiding digital traces. The suitcase, they said, was like a traveling toolkit for deception, everything he needed to blend in just enough before disappearing with valuables, or worse." Jake's mother stood in the doorway wrapped in a blanket, her face pale as she took in the scene, and said, "I knew something was wrong, I just didn't know how bad." Miko finally stopped barking and lay down beside the suitcase, panting but calm now, as if his job was done. The police took photographs of everything, marked the evidence, and placed the suitcase in a sealed container while the man was led away in cuffs, still silent, not once looking back at Jake or anyone else in the room. Jake couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if Miko had not reacted the way he did, or if Marcus hadn't agreed to stop by for that garage project. The thought chilled him, and he found himself sitting on the porch later that night, staring into the dark yard, replaying everything from the moment the man first spoke his name to the second he was taken away. Miko sat beside him, resting his head on Jake's knee, eyes still alert but peaceful. Jake reached down, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "Good boy, you saved us, buddy. You really saved us." That suitcase could have been the end of something. Instead, it became the start of something else, something that would change the way Jake looked at people, at stories, at the way someone can smile and lie at the same time. The days that followed were filled with questions from detectives, neighbors, and even local reporters as news of the arrest spread throughout the neighborhood. People who had waved at the man or seen him walking Miko in the early mornings were stunned to learn that he was not Jake's grandfather at all, but a well-disguised con artist who had been operating across the region for years. Jake found it hard to sleep despite the sense of relief that the man was gone. Every creak in the house made him sit up and check the locks again, but Miko always stayed close, now sleeping near the door, tail curled tight, ears twitching at the faintest sound. Jake spent hours going through the recovered evidence alongside Marcus and the police. Many of the photos in the suitcase matched homes that had reported thefts or strange break-ins in the past few years. Some were still open cases, and now detectives had new leads thanks to the man's obsessive documentation. What surprised everyone the most was how meticulous the man had been with his research, down to names of pets, family routines, even shopping habits. Yet despite all that, he had not accounted for a trained canine with instincts that no disguise could fool. Miko had sensed something was wrong from the very beginning and never backed down. The precinct honored Miko with a medal for bravery during a small ceremony, and the local newspaper ran a story titled "Hero Dog Uncovers Fugitive Conman," complete with a photo of Miko sitting proudly next to Jake in front of the house. Jake's parents became more cautious too. They installed new security systems, added motion lights around the property, and began reconnecting with distant relatives just to make sure there were no more unknown surprises lurking out there. Jake started keeping a small journal, recording everything that had happened in detail, not just for himself, but in case someone else ever faced something similar. He wanted to remember how easy it was to let someone in based on a smile and a story, and how dangerous that could become. Jake's neighbors stopped by with treats for Miko and warm casseroles for the family. As word continued to spread, one older couple from 3 blocks away told Jake that the same man had knocked on their door a few months back, claiming to be a friend of their late son. They turned him away because something felt off, and now they were shaken by how close they had come to being victims too. Jake realized that the Man's strategy wasn't just about stealing, it was about inserting himself, slowly earning trust, gathering details, and then vanishing once he had everything he wanted. Jake wondered how many people had let their guard down just like he almost had, and whether all of them had been as lucky as he was to have someone like Miko watching over them. The district attorney later confirmed that the man had a long list of charges pending, including fraud, identity theft, possession of illegal surveillance material, and trespassing. He was being held without bail and faced a sentence that would likely keep him behind bars for a long time. Jake hoped that was true, but he still looked over his shoulder now and then, still locked every door twice, and still kept Miko's leash by the door just in case, because sometimes evil doesn't come with horns or a mask. Sometimes it wears a sweater, carries a suitcase, and smiles like family. Months passed, and though the fear had slowly faded from the house, the lessons from that week stayed with Jake and his family in ways that words could not fully describe. Jake took time off from work to spend with his parents, who had grown quieter and more reflective since the incident. They began sorting through old family albums and records, not to dwell on the past, but to better understand where they had come from and who had once been part of their lives. It was in one of these boxes that Jake discovered a faded letter from a relative they had lost touch with decades ago, someone his parents had forgotten about, someone who had once been kind but disappeared after a disagreement. That letter reminded Jake that real family was messy, imperfect, and complicated, but it was never silent and never showed up unannounced with a suitcase full of lies. Miko continued to receive visitors, neighbors, children, school teachers, and even local journalists came to see the dog that had sniffed out the truth and protected his family from a man who had fooled so many others. Jake built a new kennel in the backyard lined with soft blankets and placed his old police badge inside it as a reminder that Miko had earned his rest. The two of them still took walks every morning though, and each time they passed by certain streets, Miko would pause, sniff, and keep walking as if checking that all was still safe. Jake decided to volunteer at the community center, leading workshops on home safety and awareness, especially for seniors and people living alone. He used his own story to teach others how deception often hides behind kindness, and that trusting your gut or your dog might save more than just your valuables. It might save your life. Jake was later contacted by a woman from another city whose father had been conned by the same man 2 years earlier. He vanished before they could confront him, but she recognized his face in the news article about Miko. She cried on the phone and told Jake that his actions had brought her family peace and that her father would have been proud to see justice finally done. That call stayed with Jake more than any thank you card or news headline. It reminded him that what had happened to him was not isolated, it was part of a larger truth, that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most familiar. The trial came quickly and Jake was called in to testify along with Marcus and a few other families affected by the man's schemes. The courtroom was tense, but Jake spoke clearly, recounting every detail from the porch meeting to the night the suitcase burst open, spilling secrets across the garage floor. The man said nothing during the entire proceeding, never offered a word in defense or apology. He simply stared ahead as if the whole thing no longer concerned him. When the sentence was finally read, Jake felt no joy, just a quiet wave of closure, knowing that others would be safe now, and that the chapter was finally closed. When he returned home that evening, Miko met him at the door, tail wagging, eyes sharp as ever, and Jake knelt down beside him, looked him in the eyes, and said, "You did more than most people ever could, buddy. You saw what none of us wanted to believe, and because of you we're all still here." And with that, the two of them stepped out into the backyard under a sky full of quiet stars, knowing that while danger might return someday, it would never get past them again, not as long as they stood watch together.